A very awesome evening to folks in Asia and an awesome morning to folks in the United States. What a great way to start the design festival, kind of designed to create a community for designers. Then to welcome our first speaker, Adam. Adam, if you are here, if you want to turn the video on so we all can see you as well. Awesome.
Hello.
Welcome. Good morning there. Adam is, amongst many other things, he's the director of community and design leadership at InVision. InVision is not a new name to any designer. It's a household name in the design circles, especially the product circles as well. Adam is passionate about design. It shows, and I'm sure we're going to enjoy a lot of the insights that he's going to share. But besides that, he's also been a pioneer in launching designbetter.co, the design leadership forum. He has now built a community that kind of connects over 3,000 product design leaders worldwide, as they share and build this ecosystem of design best practices and principles all around the world. He's also the author of the Design Leadership Insights Report. I'm sure we're going to hear a little bit about that as well. More interesting, he's a recovering restaurateur. He's a broadcaster. By the looks of his room and the little guitar that I see at the back, I'm sure he is a musician as well at heart. A multi-talented personality. Warm welcome, Adam. All yours.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm about to share quite a bit about me, and I always like to know who I'm talking to. I'm going to be checking out the chat throughout today's session, but if you could just really quickly jump in and say hi if you're new to Zoom. I would encourage you under the to area, make sure that you click to all panelists and attendees, and just let me know where you're watching from. That'd be awesome just to see who I'm talking to. So great. Is it okay if I...
Yeah, one of the things I was gonna say, Adam, if it helps you, we were gonna ask this question a little later, but we can do that now. Is to put a little poll. So the team can put the poll, poll number 1 on the screen. This will hopefully allow Adam to also, visualize who is in the audience in terms of the profession or the work area.
Perfect. This is great.
So, what's the latest experiments with music, Adam? I see.
I like to make a lot of noise, and sometimes it sounds organized. So most of the time, I spend time playing piano downstairs, and if I'm really, really in a great mood, then the guitar comes a little bit more naturally. But yeah, I usually am just playing piano in the house. And I'm looking at these poll results start to come in. It's about the type of audience makeup that we were anticipating, which is really cool. Just for the sake of time, is it okay if I start diving into the presentation and do a screen share?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so if I've done this right, everyone should see dark mode over here on the left. Is that right?
Yes.
And now you can see the title slide. Great. All right. So thank you so much for the introduction. I'm Adam Fry-Pierce. I'm the director of customer experience programs here at InVision. Now, I'm going to be mentioning InVision quite a bit today. If you don't know what that is, we're a software company. We make collaboration tools for product design teams. And when these tools are all used together, this is where essentially we're the modern operating system for the digital team. Now, I've got a really unique role at InVision. I sit on this team called the Design Transformation Team. And in that, I've had the opportunity to consult with dozens of enterprise product teams throughout the years. And I really get to see a really intimate look as to how they build products. Now, I also oversee this community called the Design Leadership Forum, not dissimilar to what y'all have here, except for specifically in design. What this is it's one of the world's largest quality communities of design leaders from enterprise environments. So there's over 3,000 members. It's a private community, and we represent most of the Fortune 500, a lot of the Inc. 5000. And I say all that to say I've seen underneath the hood of enough product teams to really have a sense of what good product teams look like. And I can tell you, it's not luck, it's not chance. Good teams are designed. And one of the key components to the best teams is to be able is the ability for the entire team to be able to do their best work, specifically the designer. But for some reason, so many product managers and designers, they really struggle to make the most out of their relationship. And so what I'm here to do is to help you understand how, I just saw from the poll, there's mostly PMs here, how PMs in particular can make the space for designers to do their best work. Now, at the end of the presentation, if you find yourself agreeing or disagreeing with anything that I have to say here, please let me know, because this thing that you're about to see, it's a story that's constantly evolving, and that happens with constant feedback. So if you'd like to get a hold of me, here's my Twitter handle. You can also find me on LinkedIn. Just go ahead and shoot me a message and let me know what you thought. And I'd love to incorporate your ideas into the next iteration of what we're doing here. But for today, here's what we're going to cover. All right, so we're gonna really quickly, I see here, again, it's not all product managers who are on the call here. So we're just gonna really quickly get on the same page and align on like, what is the optimal product team look like? And what's the role of the product manager there? And what's the role of the designer in particular? And then we're gonna get to the highlight. We're gonna go over the 5 tips for PMs to better unleash the value of design. And then last, I'm gonna give you some resources as to how to just help you in the road ahead. So let's dive in. What is the modern product team? So this is what a lot of people will refer to as EPD. And that's your engineering, your product manager, and your designer. This is what other teams call the squad. And that's what we're calling the squad. Envision just produced a film all about the relationships here that happen. What this really is it's the core team that oversees a portfolio, a product, a feature set, in some cases a zone. And sometimes there's other disciplines that are part of this as well, depending on the context of what you're solving for. That could be somebody in marketing or somebody in data. But at the core of every squad, every EPD, typically is the designer, the product manager, and the engineer. So when I reference squad today, I'm really talking about those 3 functions. Now, like I mentioned, I sit on this thing called the Design Leadership Forum. Absolutely honored and privileged to be overseeing it. And we poll our community quite often just to get a pulse of, what are the top design leaders in the world thinking about? What are the trends that they're solving for? What does their team look like? And in a recent questionnaire, we asked, what's your typical ratio? You've probably seen something similar to this. Maybe the ratios are a little off, but probably similar. And that was that we heard from design teams that for every product manager, there's typically 8 engineers, maybe 10 engineers, and 2 designers. Now, let's really quickly talk about the PM of today. Everybody is from product management. So if you aren't, here are the 3 archetypes that we're going to talk about throughout today's session. Let's just align really quickly. This is from McKinsey. Here they share their view on what those 3 archetypes are. You got technologists who, no surprise, their focus is on technology solutions. And then in the middle here, you have what I identify as, which is a generalist. McKinsey likes to call this the focus on user delight. I like to prefer to say user value. And then you have the business-oriented PM that's all about maximizing specific business metrics. Now, if you're on the call as a PM, there's a really good chance that you find yourself identifying with one or more likely all of these. These are just supposed to be primary representations of a particular mindset, but not at all supposed to be the only bucket where a specific PM falls under. Like any business owner, which is essentially what a product manager is a mini business owner, they work across multiple areas. So for me, I'm heavy towards the generalist type, and then I'm business oriented on the back end, with technology being the third type of personality that I represent. And for several other PMs on the call, you might be the complete opposite. 80% of your mind share might be more weighted towards the technologist. The point is that PMs typically blend in between all 3 of these, and that's pretty much it for everyone who's not on the call. Hopefully you have a really good or who's not a PM on the call. Hopefully you now have a better idea as to what we're talking about here. So let's talk about the role of the designer really quick. Now, we should pause here. The answer to this question was different 10 years ago as much as it was different 2 years ago, and certainly different 6 months ago. We're kind of in this new era, ever since the coronavirus has hit, and there's been this global pandemic and the rolling economic shutdowns. We're in this thing now where the world looks really similar to what it looked like before, but it's different. Consumer behaviors are different. People take themselves through the world a little bit more guarded, and that ends up impacting all of the products that we use, right? And how we use them. We're in this thing that I like to call the social distance economy. And squads have to be asking this question, how can you best understand the ground as it's moving underneath your feet? And since the pandemic hit, I heard from product teams everywhere, and I'm sure this is true for you too, you've had to, completely throw away your roadmap, that you've had to patch it up, burn it down, you name it. The point is that the way that roadmaps were set up previously, they were a bit too rigid for the environment that we've entered this year, where everything changed just enough to really alter the course of our plans. And I've heard from a lot of PMs, especially in the last few months, that they feel like in order to answer this question, which is one of the most important questions you can answer, is that you're going to have to rebuild your org, rebuild how your squad operates so that you can better understand that changing landscape. And from the PMs, they've said, hey, if I can do this, if I can change the organizational makeup of my squad, then I feel like we're going to be in a better position to connect with our customers and just overall better track the changes in our customers' behavior. And where I like to say is, enter the designer. This is where the designer is uniquely educated and skilled to be the constant voice of the customer on your squad. In the time of coronavirus or not, this is true, but it's especially true now. And the designer's background just puts them in the perfect position to help your squad mitigate any go-to-market risk. Now, a lot of people, I'm not saying you necessarily, but when you hear design, you probably just think of this, right? You probably hear of, you think of a logo, or you think of, design as the thing that you wrap around really profitable code to make it look nice. But it's really just the tip of the iceberg. Design's so much more than that. Design is layered down to where, if you go from UI down to interaction, it's the way that a customer will end up going through a certain app that you have built. Below that, you have service design, which is really all about mapping out things like, customer service lines, which are the best ones are designed. Anybody in professional services will tell you that service design is a key part of the differentiation of what makes for good service and bad service. Further down the iceberg, you have things like user research. And then when design is really used at its most broad and most capable, you have this thing called experience strategy, where a designer is brought in to solve the problem of the second that your target customer starts to think about the main problem that you're trying to solve for, how do you end up nurturing them into your product? And then how do you end up converting them from your product space into becoming a customer for life? The designer, when used at their best, is part of that conversation, and it's very purposeful, and they do have a place there. So I could spend the rest of this time talking about what the designer is and what it isn't. I'm sure there's going to be other great sessions here that are going to do that, but I just wanted to really quickly align on the modern squad, who the PM is and who the designer is and what they can do. So let's just really quickly dive into the meat of this conversation today, the core of it, which is your 5 tips on how to unleash design. I'm going to go over these 5 areas. We're going to talk about the idea of how important it is to mature design practices, which really is just to say how to mature your entire squad's practices, but be intentional about that investment. We're going to talk about roadmaps and how the most rigid ones just aren't really built for the quick moving world that we're in today. We're going to talk about stakeholder alignment, how to do that. We're going to end here on some of my favorite areas, which are squad culture and team rituals. So let's start with this entire idea of, design maturity and what you can do. I'm assuming that most people here are kind of mid-level product managers. So what can you do to inspire leadership to actually invest more into maturing your practices? Now, I want to bring your attention to this right here. It's a study that Envision did last year. I'm holding it up right now. If I'm on audio, you won't see it, but What this is it's the world's largest study on the impact of organizational design maturity as it correlates to business. And you've probably heard of McKinsey's business value of design, or the Design Management Institute studies that talk about the value of design. Most of their sample sizes are a few hundred. There are a few hundred companies. We went just kind of all out here, and we just wanted to blow the data set out of the water. So we ended up surveying 2,200 companies, most of which were enterprises from 77 different countries in over 24 industries. And what we found is that this thing that people have been saying forever, there's value to design, that it turns out that there's statistical correlation between a company's ability to adopt design, meaning unleash those design practices, and the benefits of design, meaning the more that they invested into design, the more money that they saw on the back end of their return. So this is to say that, in the typical equation of a low mature team where one designer plus one product manager equaled, a given output, let's call it 2. For high mature environments, 1 + 1 ends up equaling 3. Now, the other part of this study is that we end up really getting an idea of where the world laid out, right? We had a huge sample size. So where are most of the enterprises, the agencies in the world? They're on the lower end of the spectrum. There's still a ton of work to be done. At the core of this study, you had 5 different levels of maturity, one being a low mature team, therefore giving low business value back to their organizations who are investing in them. And then on the upper end, you had a level 5 team where design is really being unleashed across the business and able to realize its potential. But what we end up seeing is that a level 3 and below team was what we're coining as low maturity, and a level 4 and 5 is what we coin as high maturity. This is really important to keep in mind for the rest of the talk. I'm going to be doing a lot of low maturity to high maturity comparisons. But here's the thing, is that product managers, designers, organization, anybody who's in charge of operations, you have tons of job security, because what we found is that 83% of the data set is still low mature, which means that only a select group of companies are really receiving the value that they can with their design investments for the business. Although 80% of companies had reported in our survey that they do usually include design on projects, either often or always, only 5% were empowering design to receive the greatest benefits, and 41% are level 1 companies. So they have significant room to grow. There's low hanging fruit. So this is really good news. Now let me give you a quick idea as to what this looks like for a high mature team versus low mature team. I talked earlier about the squad. Now, a few of you might even already be worried, like, my designer doesn't actually sit on my team. That's okay. But if they end up sitting on your team, you'll see that at a level 5 company, a high mature organization, that we see that design is 3 times more likely to be sitting with their counterparts in engineering and product management. I'll provide the source of the data at the end of this. But we had a previous Forrester analyst be leading this entire initiative. There's lots of good data points for you to chew into here. We also saw that designers were 4 times more likely to develop key products and features within their key business partners. Now, for any business-oriented PM on the call, this is your slide. This is where you want to be taking screenshots. High design maturity end up delivering complete outsized benefits compared to low mature teams. We saw that where there was investment for high mature teams, that there was 4 times the amount of return on revenue versus low mature counterparts. There was 5 times the amount of cost savings compared to their low mature counterparts, because a high mature team has things where design gets systematized. You see design systems being operated. You see DevOps and design ops working in tandem together. So it's not surprising that there's a huge cost savings for more mature practices. Your time to market, you're 6 times faster to go to market if you're operating with the designer close to your squad in a high mature environment. And for every business owner here, this should really get you excited. There is a 26% or 26 times more likelihood to impact things like overall shareholder valuation through certain outcomes that have outputs of design patents and IP specifically for that company in high mature environments. So that's all to say that design is the differentiator here. When design becomes completely integrated into the core of the business, you find that brands deliver consistent and excellent customer experiences. And in companies like these, design is empowered to influence the business strategy, to drive customer research, to lead experimentation, and ultimately transform the overall CX. And once design is this deeply integrated, either into the company or into the squad, you see that outsized business growth occurs. And don't just take it from us. Let's look at some other studies that are out there. You had IBM, which is probably the biggest example of a single company who has invested into design, report with their work with Forrester back in 2018 that they saw 75% reduced design time within their squad. They saw a third less time spent for development cycles, and overall their time to market reduced by about 30%. Pretty spectacular. This is all just the business case as to why you need to be investing into maturing design practices and help create the space. If you don't oversee design yourself, this is where you should go inspire leadership to be investing into maturing practices in general. This doesn't happen over a day. You'll be lucky to see increments over a quarter. This is long-term planning that ends up really taking place over a year or maybe even years. And if you're wondering like, well, I want to know how can I just do a gut check? You can go out there and do audits and surveys and all that stuff. But if you wanted to just give yourself a quick check, here's what level 5 squads do. Everybody on the team shares a quotable North Star, meaning if you went and asked your engineers, your designers, or other PMs, why are you here, that they might say the same thing, or at least that it's similar. You'd see that the way that they talk about their business and about their products has shared vocabulary, that there's not all the, inside baseball terms that are gated for designers, engineers, or PMs, that everyone's talking about things using the same language. You'll see that the lines of design, product, and engineering, that those lines start to blur a little bit within the where the work actually happens, that the workflow is typically connected through a central set of tools and platforms. You see that the squad has rituals, which we're going to talk about today. And you also see that they're typically measured by the same metrics. They all know what success means, and they can all, if asked that question, what does success look like in a quarter or in a year, that they'll say the same thing. So what can you do? That's a lot of information. Great. There's validation as to why we should be investing into design practices, but what can I do about it, right? Here's my simple challenge. If you have a model where design is not embedded into the squad, I would advocate for a squad experiment. I would go to product leadership. I would show them the industry proof. You have this study, which you're going to have a reference to by the end of this talk. And you have plenty of other studies out there. The McKinsey Business Value of Design is a great one. Check out the Design Management Institute. There have been reports after reports that show that the investment pays off, but that has to be a top-down leadership initiative. And if you end up getting pushback, I would encourage you to experiment with work streams. Now, this isn't a new idea. Really, it's an organizational design concept where you take a small experiment into a small group without really having to do a complete reorganization, and you run that test, and then you compare the results to tests outside of a work stream. I would say take a product or a feature, take a sprint cycle and do it with a squad model and see what the outputs were on the other side. You're likely to see that there was less friction during things like handoff, that communication happened a little bit more steadily, and that you're overall just saving iteration cycles. I would encourage you to run a workstream experiment. Now, if you do have a squad model and you're thinking, well, how can I do this? I don't oversee the budget for people ops or development. I would encourage you to go back to that slide that I just shared, and I'll share this deck with the Institute so you can go reference it. But I would focus on workflow. How is your tooling? Are the teams actually set on a shared KPI or OKR structure? Do you have a single North Star? And just run that test. Go ask the rest of your squad, why do you think we're here? And see what they say. And if there's inconsistencies, that gives you an idea as to what you should be focusing on. Another one that I would encourage you to check out is reconsider your roadmaps and your rituals. And this is one that we're actually going to talk about today. And, as luck has it, we're going to talk about roadmaps right now. So tip number 2 is evaluate the way that you roadmap. Like I said earlier, the times right now are really uncertain. Like we're in a whole new economy. And as such, your roadmap needs to be flexible. Roadmaps need to be able to respond to change, and your squad needs to be able to challenge your own assumptions and conducting continuous research as well as validation. One way to accomplish this is to subscribe to a more flexible roadmap. I like to use the outcomes-based roadmap, which favors outcomes over outputs. Traditional roadmaps are essentially a push model, right? They're all about releasing specific features by specific dates, and requirements come from the top down and they make their way into your backlog. But as we shift towards thinking more about outcomes, we find ourselves operating more in a pull model, and things change for the better. We make product decisions and prioritization based on customer feedback first. And because people are elastic, their behaviors change, so must the roadmaps. They can't be static. They're too rigid for how the world operates today. If there's one thing that 2020 has taught us, it's that, or at least taught product teams, it's that your roadmaps have to be flexible. So let me take you there. Here's an outcomes-based roadmap. There's lots of great resources out there. I borrowed this one specifically from VMware's design field guide that they published last year. This is such a flexible roadmap that should be able to help your team. Now, this tool shifts the conversation away from features, and it makes it all about the customer. It forces your squad to prioritize the change in customer behavior that you're trying to achieve over a set of features or the product itself. So here's the key components. Up here in the left column, you've got the current time horizon, which is from now to the next 3 months. And then in near term, you have 3 to 6 month time horizons, and then future is 6 months and out. And the further out that you go, the less certainty that you have, and so the less features or solutions that you need to have planned. Now, this type of roadmap makes customer research absolutely critical. This does not work if you're not interviewing customers, often. So first and foremost, you have to subscribe to customer research. I would be running a quick sprint to gather that research, gather customer input, depending on what problems that you're trying to solve for. Once you have those problems, you being the great PM that you are, you can balance what those problems are against what the business needs, and then prioritize which ones you're able to solve right now, soon, and long term. So take the one that makes the most sense for the business, and that goes here on your left column. That problem is what you are designing for. And then comes in the outcome part of the roadmap. We are moving to the thing that you are actually trying to focus on, the behavior that you're changing for, since that's what design is all about anyways, right? It's trying to change human behaviors. So what you need to do with this roadmap is articulate which behaviors you're trying to change and design for, and then you're going to identify how you're measuring success, and then and only then do you spend time with your teams iterating on what features or products that you can do to bring this to life. And then you validate those features with your customers. Again, more conversations. And you repeat this process for the near term and the future term. And voila, you have your outcomes-based roadmap. Now, I recommend visiting this roadmap often to check in. Some teams do this daily. And some teams do this on a weekly basis. I would recommend that you, regardless of your cadence, that you do this on a semi-regular basis, and you also use this as a platform to take back to your stakeholders and align, just to make sure that everybody's really on the same page, so you don't have what people lovingly call swoop and poop later on. So how can an outcomes-based roadmap really help? The bottom line is use frameworks that are flexible. That's the biggest takeaway of this tip. And the outcomes-based roadmap can help here. It's going to help you align on product and vision and strategy from day one. It's going to allow you to keep focused on a single outcome at a time, moving the metrics incrementally. It's going to allow you to prioritize based on business and user value. And it's going to establish alignment with the other stakeholders and teams because the tool is meant to be socialized, which is perfect into our third tip, which is aligning with stakeholders. Now, I might be the first one to say this during the conference, but I certainly won't be the last. And that's that stakeholder alignment is critical. And I'm sure you know this already, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. But something that you might not know is design leaders from the Design Leadership Forum, that community that I oversee, they reported that some of the largest blockers of overall squad alignment it stemmed from the top line squad leaders, the top line EPD leaders being misaligned. And it is common for engineering, product, and design to actually be measured differently, and that's okay. But you have to know how these goals end up rolling down to your individual team members. So how can you do this? While PM is the direct line to stakeholders, you should naturally be the person to align with them. But remember, it's up to the squad to clarify exactly who should be doing what. So you need to align on roles. So when the question comes up as to who's going to be aligning with stakeholders, remind everybody that the PM is in the best place to do so. Just like design has their role, they're in the best place to be the customer voice and to best be connecting with the customer. You are in the best place to connect with the business, but you have to clarify that role first. Now, number two is whether you use outcomes-based roadmaps or not, be sure to use some sort of planning framework that makes room for stakeholder input early and often. And this is the best way to keep stakeholders from focusing on things like features or prioritizing the backlog. It's important to note that creating a successful outcomes-based roadmap is really all about setting achievable and desirable goals. So work really carefully to define those intended results and then ground them in reality. The third one, there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat. There's a lot of different ways that you can solve a problem. For your team to be able to find the best solution, they need to be able to experiment with different solutions and then validate them with customers. This is where you can collaborate closely with your designers and de-risk your go-to-market. As the direct line to stakeholders, you must once again clear the space for your squad to experiment. And this is a good time to err on the side of permission rather than ask for forgiveness. The last thing you want to do is run a bunch of experiments in a vacuum without anyone knowing about it. So if I were you, I would make a very quick business case and tell your leadership why you should be building experimentation into the way that your squad operates, that you're trying to become more of a customer-driven decision-making group, and that you're trying to just bring the customer into the DNA of how the squad operates. Now, I'll give you some bullet points in just a second if you need to give a business case on why experimentation matters, but that's the point here. Lastly, I would really spend some time defining your success metrics. Again, no surprise to anybody here, but I just wanted to reinforce that for any of the newer PMs, make sure that you're really tracking success metrics and then communicating them to your team and your stakeholders. It doesn't really matter which alignment framework that you're using, but it is critical that your outcomes are measurable. If you don't state a target, it's really hard to say if you hit the goal or not. So communicate your progress or goals against your stakeholders. Now, I mentioned experimentation. A quick note, remember that new Design Frontier report? This made a really clear case for why squads should constantly be investing into maturing their practices, specifically with experimentation. We learned that the best squads in the world, the best teams that we're all familiar with, I won't name brand names here, but they're ones that developed cultures of constant experimentation. And the business results speak for themselves, right? Companies that embraced nonstop experimentation were 6 times more likely to decrease their time to market and 4 times more likely to have an impact on revenue, which PMs, that's like what we're all about, right? Is trying to make our business impact really clear. Experimentation will help you do that. All right, tip number 4, coming to our last 2 tips here. This one's a little bit softer, and go with me for a second. I encourage you this week to ask yourself a single question. How much conscious and cognitive energy are you putting into shaping your squad's culture? Most of us work 160 hours to 200 hours a month. And many of you are working to are probably not answering questions like this, like how are you molding your culture? And I would encourage you to reconsider how you're using some of your time here, because there is a clear link between outcomes and culture. According to the Leader's Guide to Corporate Culture, culture curation is one of the best areas that you can spend as your time as a leader. And this is it's a difficult to control area, right? Like who influences culture? My stance is that the higher up in the organization that you go, the more influence that you have. And as a member of your squad, you, whether you know it or not, are already impacting the culture and what it feels like to work on that squad. So I encourage you to just to have a mindful and purposeful impact on your squad's culture rather than an ignorant one. And after all, research and practical experience has shown that when you're evaluating how culture affects outcomes, which is, again, the context and how the organization operates, things like geographic region, industry, strategy, leadership, company structure. It matters. The strength of the culture matters quite a bit. And again, tough to measure, but really easy to feel. And there's not going to be a one size fits all here. Depending on your industry or on your company or your team, it may make sense to have a different culture type. And there's certainly different types. Not all squads should be modeled the same. I would encourage you to check out this resource at the Harvard Business Review. Just Google the culture factor in 2018 and you'll see this chart. Further on in this article, you'll learn that there's different archetypes for different types of teams. Now, depending on your industry, like I said, or on your team, it may make sense to have a different kind of culture. For any new product leader here, any new product manager, I would encourage you to set up a culture like this, where you may want to really be dedicated as a servant leader towards creating a space of learning, enjoyment, and results so that you and the rest of your squad can end up really owning the culture curation together. According to authors of How You Shape Your Culture, this model can end up leading to individual team satisfaction, engagement, and retention, and here's why this really matters to you. This ends up creating a squad with a higher likelihood to create more impact over the span of the year because you're just not doing things that a general PM might be having to do, like filling headcount that you just lost because maybe retention is an issue at your company or on your squad. When you have those things like engagement, individual satisfaction, and retention, your output and your outcomes are going to be of higher quality than those that put more of an emphasis on things like order and authority. So how can you do this? Culture is, again, a really squishy area. I would encourage you to start by simply talking to your team about what you want to become. And if I were inheriting a new squad, here's what I would do. I would carve out space real early in some of our team meetings to ask this question, to have an open discussion. What do we want to be? And this can probably just take a few days, maybe a week. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, this is like no time at all, right? It's a drip in the bucket and totally worth it. I would invite your team to build this with you as well. And if you do have a designer that you're trying to figure out how to bring closer to the fold, ask them to help you facilitate the exercise. There's 100% chance that there's going to be whiteboarding sessions in these activities. They know how to do that. And if you give them the problem that you're trying to solve for, they have an entire toolbox in which they'll know exactly which activity and exercise to help bring out to help you solve the problem. I would just share your goals for the session with them and figure out, exactly how you're going to accomplish that together with your designer. And if they can't do it, don't worry. There's plenty of easy frameworks out there for you to adopt. I would encourage you to Google the V2 MOM framework from Salesforce. It's in book's not next to me. I should grab it, but it's in the Salesforce playbook that was published a few years ago by Mark Benioff. Now, the third way that you can help is during the activity. Remember, you probably don't need to start from scratch. You really don't need to reinvent the wheel here. You can use your company's principles and vision statements as a starting point, right? It's up to your squad to translate how the top line company principles end up impacting you at a team level. For example, let's use Tesla. If I go back a slide, Tesla was one that is a company that's committed to being a learning organization, and they are very purposely trying to create a culture of learning. It's built into their vision statement. So if your squad works at Tesla, what does that mean for you? What does that mean, for your daily stand-ups or weekly stand-ups? Does this mean that you do things like creating micro training sessions so that everybody can really quickly talk about something that they learned this week and try and teach each other? Does it mean that you're investing in things like communities of practice? How the top line principles and visions translate to your squad are really up to you, but that's the cool part of this is you get to contextualize those values and really put it to work to see how it's going to manifest for you at a team level. Now, the last one is probably the most important. Let's say the rest of this stuff doesn't work. This last one is the one thing that you should be taking away, perhaps from this entire presentation, but certainly this slide. It does not matter if your company doesn't have this, but make sure that you create a place where you can have candor and open feedback built into your DNA of your squad. And it can really just be that simple. A core principle for your team to be honest and be committed to candor is all you need. And if this principle can end up having, effects beyond what the obvious are, which are, people conflicts, we can help solve problems more easily, but it goes way beyond that. You end up creating a space where the team is committed to feedback first. And that means that it's committed to stakeholder feedback, to customer feedback, and peer feedback. And this becomes really easy to do if everybody agrees from the beginning that a core principle is candor. I'll give you a quick example as to how this can help. Now, at InVision, we have this as a top-down principle. I've lived through this, and I can tell you it makes a big difference. The way that people use it at our company is pretty inspiring. When we have an all-hands meeting where our CEO says something that maybe somebody disagrees with, because we have this principle built into the fabric of our company, we actually have these printed out cards that sit next to our desk, and we can hold up a principle saying, hey, a moment of compassionate candor. I disagree with something that you just said. And what that does is it essentially allows the person that's holding that card to wear that principle like armor. Ego no matter, or is no longer part of the conversation. We're able to have a discussion about an objective idea and discuss its merits rather than focus on the person or the context in which the idea is stemming from. So that's all to say is, really dedicate yourself to understanding the idea of candor. If you need a book, check out my screen right now. This book is all you need. Radical Candor by Kim Scott. I will say too, in the Design Leadership Forum, this book, we ask all the time, what's a book that you're gifting others? What book would you gift your team? This book is twice the amount of any other response. It's double. It is the most voted book for recommended reading for design leaders across the world. If you need something added to your reading list, I highly encourage you to check out Radical Candor. Yes, thank you, Marie, in the chat. I appreciate that for dropping it. Okay, tip number 5. Team rituals and traditions. This one's going to go quick. Building traditions and rituals really it doesn't need a step-by-step guide, and you don't need one either. Yours can be something small and simple, like a weekly stand-up that starts with a simple round-robin question, checking in on the humans that you work with. Like, how are you doing? Before you actually dive into the work itself. The key here is that rituals, regardless of what they look like, they need to focus on the person, on the human, on the squad, the person behind the function, not just the designer, but who that person is. So I'm talking about real and organic opportunities to bond with team members. The specific actions of the ritual itself, full disclosure, they don't really matter. The thing that's really important here is that you are investing into activities that bring the team together. The other important part about this, I talked a lot earlier about things that might be really heavy to do, organizational endeavors, investing, like inspiring up. This is a bite-sized thing that you can do as a product manager, is just carve out time and build rituals. Perhaps it might be the best use of your time, in addition to the idea of instilling candor into your team's fabric, is creating rituals, because this will end up actually creating connective tissue with the designers, with the engineers, regardless of where they sit in the organization. And that's what all this is about, right? It's all about trying to create a better space where you can collaborate. And collaboration doesn't just happen. It happens based on trust. And trust only happens with time together, right? Create spaces where you can do rituals. Now, I'm going to ask for anybody on Twitter, tweet me really quick. I'm really curious, like, if you have rituals, what are your favorite ones, or which ones have you heard about? Here's my Twitter handle, and I would use the hashtag squad rituals. I'm going to tell you probably one of my favorite rituals that I've heard over the years is this idea of 5x5 storytelling. Now, this idea comes from San Francisco-based digital agency RGA, and they have this awesome tradition called 5x5s. On the 5th day of every month at 5 p.m., 5 team members, they stand up in the rest of to the rest of the department. Now they get together on Zoom, and they share a turning point of something that happened in their lives for 5 minutes. The talks rarely have anything to do with work, but they're built to bring the team together. And the quote that I have to read because it's so powerful, this is from one of the executive creative directors there. He said, these nights accelerate the notion of bringing your authentic self to the office, because they move us from just being a random group of people who work together to becoming members of the team. Of course, it has nothing to do with design. It means for you, it has nothing to do with the craft, but it has everything to do with the culture, which is, again, one of the best ways that you can spend your time as a product manager and an overall servant leader. So please let me know what your favorite rituals are. I'd love to hear what you're doing. And I have one more question for you, which is, I mentioned stand-ups earlier. Do you have a stand-up, and what does it look like? I'd love to hear what you do. And again, you can find me on Twitter right here and use the hashtag squad standups. Now, my stand-ups that I borrowed from a colleague that I absolutely love, we've really made it our own, is we will meet for 15 minutes every day. And the time is important. I would encourage you not to spend more than 15 minutes here, because it's, data has proven that we enter the land of endless meetings if we want to. If you set 30 minutes, if you set an hour, if you set 2 hours, your team will probably maximize that time. So time box it. Make the stand up 5 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes if you have a large enough team, and ask this open-ended question. Not everybody has to answer. Has anyone heard anything interesting? What's the water cooler moment, which becomes even more important in a remote environment, right? What did you all hear this week that we should all know about? And do you need help with anything? And then we do a very quick rapid fire around the group. What's everybody working on? Just bullet points. Quick, 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 quick. That way the entire team has context as to what their peers are working on, and you have less of the operator lost in translation effect that ends up happening. So that's the 5 tips. As far as where can you go to learn more resources, I like to think that every single company has these 3 lenses of business. Whether you know it or not, you are putting these values out to your customers of practices, of people, and of platforms. Most of us really focus on platforms, but I wanted to share resources in all 3 of these areas for you today. Under the people bucket, I mentioned earlier that I oversee this community called the Design Leadership Forum. It's at designleadership.com. If you identify yourself as a design leader, meaning like you're at a director level or above, or you're in a product leadership role and you're overseeing the design function, and you'd like to go deeper and talk to your peers in a really safe space about what those shared challenges are and just get an inside perspective of how your peers are talking about these problems, check it out. It's at designleadership.com. I'm the curator of it, so you can also just find me anywhere on LinkedIn or social and just ask me questions. But we meet often and we ask these questions. Or we have discussions about shared challenges, and then we air those out and we learn together. Now, this is a private community. I will say that this isn't open to everybody. We really focus on creating a relevant space. And so please don't get offended if you nominate yourself and don't get accepted. This is really built for people managers first and foremost. But if you do fit that criteria, we'd love to have you and we'd love to talk to you. Next up, under the practices bucket, I mentioned a bunch of things. I'm just going to focus on the stuff that Envision has put out. Go back and check out the slide deck at the footers if you wanted the other resources, but I would encourage you to check out designbetter.co. This is a place of immense value, lots of free books, but don't take that to mean cheap. We have invested a lot of time and energy into understanding what the best practices are in product design, and we publish on these often. One book in particular that I'd like to focus everybody on is this new book that we just published called Remote Work for Design Teams. Most of us are operating in a remote environment, and this can help. I'd also check out the new Design Frontier, which is that report that I referenced a lot. And lastly, our platforms. Envision is a space, after all, where digital collaboration happens. We can be the ecosystem for end-to-end product building. So I would encourage you to check us out. I'll go ahead and drop links in a second. I know we're short on time, so I'm just going to really quickly get to the end here and just say thank you so much for having me. Thank you for your engagement. Looks like the chat was nuts. Hit me with your questions.
That was certainly over a few minutes, but absolutely worth it. Thanks a lot, Adam. This was, feels like around the world in 30 minutes. We went from every aspect of design to the squad, to the value, to the interlock, to a lot of actionable insights. So truly appreciate. There's a feedback poll that's going to come up on the screen. So feel free to give some feedback on how we make these sessions even better for the community. While the feedback poll is up, there was actually about 8 or 9 large themes that have emerged. In interest of time, we'll try to post them on LinkedIn, Adam, and if you can kind of answer them on the LinkedIn thread, that'll be great. But there was this one question that kind of was very popular in the questions that we saw. And this was the whole B2B versus B2C. How much of that squad, how much of the quantification, the value that you mentioned Natrajan asked about curiosity. Shilpa asked about the whole concept of hardware versus software. But if you can focus on the B2B versus B2C in a quick response, what do you think would be different in your opinion?
Yeah. So let me play back the question. Is the core of the question, what's the difference between a squad who operates in a B2B or versus B2C?
That's right.
Okay. My take is that think about what a squad's supposed to do, right? Everything is supposed to be building experiences or outcomes for people mostly, and in some cases systems, but really that all ends up trickling down to people. I would say that there's not much difference. Everything has to do with completely being dedicated to customer driven outcomes. So while the squad might look differently or have totally different outputs, I'd say the general practices at a fairly mid altitude should be the same, right? The squad still needs to be prioritizing things like how they communicate, how they end up doing handoff, the overall maturity of their collective practices. All that stuff matters. And that's going to be transferable from B2C to B2B to B2C. Now, I will say that some squads, they're in a little bit more of a difficult position, especially those in B2C environments right now, where, like I mentioned earlier, we're in a new age and there are entire businesses, entire teams that, my heart goes out to you if you've been impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. But really the thing that we learned is that the roadmap issue was a big problem this year. And because of that, people couldn't change fast enough. So I would, again, take all these tips and say, if you can subscribe to these, you actually end up putting the entire squad in a better position, not only to be able to survive in moments like this, where everything's changed underneath your feet, but maybe even thrive in it, because customer behaviors have changed. But if you have really strong, dedicated research muscles, you can adjust with your customers in live time, or at least with very little latency.
And I really like the notion of stakeholder management. I think the actionable tips that you gave there as well, I think it's also very important to make sure it's not the squad, but the layers up and the layers below are in line and in sync as well, right? Well, super. That's just about all the time. Unfortunately, we had, I'm sure we're going to have Adam again for a more deeper conversation at some point in the festival. But truly appreciate Adam. Here's a little, speaking about remote and virtual. Here's our little virtual thank you badge for you. And I truly appreciate your time and effort, Adam. Thanks a lot for doing this.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate y'all having me.